Joining me now is Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator Coons, thank you very much for being with us today. Let me ask you, do you really believe that if push comes to shove and the president pushes these tariffs on Monday, that Republican senators will stand up and say no? Do you believe that they will follow through on that?
Well, John, that's the great challenge of the Senate these days, is that there are a number of Republican senators who privately express grave concerns about the president's conduct, about the things we learned in the Mueller Report, about his obstruction of justice. There have been public events over the last couple of years where they've expressed real concern. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis, the initial application of steel tariffs against many of our closest allies around the world, his withdrawal from TPP. On each of these instances, there was a dozen or so Republicans who expressed some concern or misgiving, but ultimately failed to even slow down, let alone stop the president from doing things that were ill-considered. Remember, our government was shut down, large parts of it, for 35 days in an ultimately pointless fight over the difference between wall and fence. And so, frankly, I don't know if they'll be able to make any difference. Hopefully, this is the break point where Senate Republicans show some wisdom and slow down our president's endless swinging of the club of tariffs and hitting some of our closest allies.
You say hopefully. It doesn't sound like you have a lot of faith that they will follow through.
Well, you know, frankly, this is a Republican caucus that tends to fall in line even when they have good reason to have profound misgivings about the president's abrupt decisions. Look, the vice president was up in Canada celebrating the lifting of steel and aluminum tariffs and progress on a new renegotiated NAFTA. I think it even caught him by surprise that President Trump chose to tweet this issue.
You are a big supporter of former Vice President Joe Biden, one of the first, earliest, strongest, any superlative I could throw in there, I think you would agree with me. He introduced a new plan to battle climate change yesterday, calling for $1.7 trillion in federal spending over 10 years with the goal of net zero greenhouse emissions by 2050. This goes
bold 22-page plan. That's right, John.
It seems you know a lot about it. A bold 22-page plan. You know it goes further than the Obama administration's proposals and plans at the time, not dissimilar to the Green New Deal. Why is this the right plan in your mind?
Well, it lays out a fair amount more detail. The Green New Deal is just a framework. This then puts into place some of the mechanics and details about how we would get there. What I think it's important for folks listening to be reminded of is that Joe Biden introduced one of the very first climate bills in the Senate and is now putting forward one of the boldest plans for how we would tackle climate. You know, I think for folks who are looking for bold leadership, but that is also seasoned and experienced on the world stage, someone who can calm the waters of our troubled alliances and yet lead us forward in a progressive direction, this makes it clear that person's Joe Biden.
So you know a lot about the plan. You no doubt have also read, since the plan's release, that a big part of it, or many of the lines within it, were taken from plans from progressive organizations without citation. Another word for that, in some circumstances, is plagiarism. They took lines and proposals directly word for word and sentences for sentences as part of the plan. The Biden campaign put out this explanation, several citations, some from sources cited, and other parts of the plan were inadvertently left out of the final version of the 22-page document. As soon as we were made aware of it, we updated to include the proper citations. Mistakes happen.
I think that's a complete and appropriate expectation. Excuse me. I think that's a complete and appropriate explanation of how a fairly broad and detailed plan was promptly, those concerns about it and the citations were promptly addressed by campaign staff.
They were, but obviously there's a little bit of a difference here when we're dealing with former Vice President Biden, which is that in 1988, he was forced from the campaign more or less because he had drawn from speeches given by British politician Neil Kinnock without citation. So it's a particularly sensitive area. So does the campaign need to be even more vigilant in this case?
Well, John, rather than quibbling over what did or didn't happen 30 years ago and whether that's an echo in today's campaign, I'd urge your voters to contrast the conduct of our president today, who was picking a fight with the mayor of London before he even landed, inserting himself in a destabilizing way into British internal politics by who he met with and who he spurned, and is further destabilizing our relationships here at home by threatening a tariff war with Mexico, with someone who we all know would be a far more seasoned and stable hand in foreign affairs. I think this was a minor issue of staff work that was promptly addressed.
Okay.
And I'm not sure you're holding him to the same standard you're holding our president.
Well, look, that aside, I think if you were to watch our broadcast in general, we hold the president to account for almost everything
Yes.
he says. I do want to get your take on the investigations into the president on the House side. And I know as a senator, you don't want to tell the House what to do. But let me ask you as a Democrat, and you're watching what's going on in the House. Next week, they're holding hearings with John Dean. We love John Dean. He's a great analyst here. And former U.S. attorneys are going to testify. Is that going to help them get to the bottom of what happened in the Russia investigation? Are those the people you want to see testifying in public as the clock ticks?
Well, I'd love to hear Robert Mueller give more detail about the first volume of his report that focuses on the ways in which Russia intentionally and broadly interfered in our last presidential election. And I'd love to hear proposals from our Republican colleagues about how we're going to protect our next election. I also do think that there are things beyond the obstruction of justice instances in the Mueller report about the conduct of cabinet officials and senior leaders in the Trump administration that are well worth investigating. We also need to continue legislating around the issues that affect the daily lives of working Americans, protecting their health care, dealing with the opioid crisis, advancing more affordable ways to get higher education like apprenticeships. There are great bills coming over from the House that they are passing that are dying in the legislative graveyard that is Mitch McConnell's Senate today.
Right.
And that, frankly, is another issue, John, I hope we'll get to.
Just yes or no, is it the time for a subpoena for Robert Mueller?
Yes, I think it's important that Robert Mueller come and testify further about the details of his report.
All right, Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, John.